We are back with Viet History Makers with Kevin Pham, my host. And today we are going to get into the last emperor of Vietnam, Emperor Bao Dai.
I'm excited for this episode. For listeners who don't know me, my name is Kevin Pham, and I'm an assistant professor of political theory at the University of Amsterdam, and I'm the author of The Architects of Dignity, Vietnamese Visions of Decolonization, published by Oxford University Press a few months ago.
So you and I, we work on who we're going to pick next in terms of the lineup. And by the way, audience members, if you have any suggestions to who you'd like to hear us profile, we'd love to hear from you. So today we are going to speak about the last emperor of Vietnam, Emperor Bao Dai.
And one thing I wanted to ask you, Ken, because you were actually the one who proposed this name as we were brainstorming. Why did you mention Bao Dai?
I think that I've always was curious about what happened to the royal family, the lineage, right? All of these kings and monarchs that we had as a people, you know, how did they just all of a sudden disappear? And what happened to these figures? So Bao Dai has always been somebody I've heard about growing up with my family, and my mom and dad talked about. But unfortunately, you know, the association with being a puppet king was always part of his moniker.
Exactly. Yeah, and I wanted to go elaborate on that because in the last episode, at the very end, so we had talked about Phan Boi Châu, who most Vietnamese people are quite proud of. He's a pioneer of anti-colonialism. But you had mentioned that Bao Dai is sort of this sad, almost pathetic figure, and I think you're largely right. That is how he is widely seen today. He's gone down in history as kind of a colonial puppet. For many Vietnamese in the diaspora, he's seen as sort of a weakling or coward. For the Vietnamese communists in Vietnam, I believe they see him as a traitor, someone who sold Vietnam to the French. But at the same time, I'm sure that some in Vietnam might be more sympathetic to him because he did briefly work for Ho Chi Minh and Ho Chi Minh's government at one point. So I hope that in this episode, we can complicate him even more. By the way, his descendants are alive. I know that one is in Florida, one's in France. So
yeah, he ended up having like 13 kids, but I mean, 5 with the Empress Nam Phuong, which is his first wife. But when I think about Bao Dai, I think about how sad his life sort of parallels the history of, you know, and when I think about him and put myself in his shoes, I'm not sure how differently I would behave. I mean, I'm just being empathetic to him. It seemed like a very complicated life that he lived. I mean, at 13, he had to kind of step up when his father passed away. So I don't think that he had much of any sort of his own volition.
right. And we're going to talk all about this. So one thing I was asking myself is, why do an episode about him? And the answer I would give is that as a symbol, he's very significant. So I actually don't know much about him as a person. And I don't believe that much is really available to us to know him as a person. But as a symbol, he's so significant. He's Vietnam's last monarch. So he plays this historical role that marks the end of thousands of years of monarchy and the beginning of something else, the beginning of new struggles between different groups with different visions of how to organize political life in Vietnam. Because when you finish the monarchy, what are you going to have? What's the opposite of a monarchy? A million other things.
Right? Yeah.
So he plays this role between the First and the Second Indochina War. So the point of this episode is not to talk about him as a person, but as this symbol, playing this transition between the First Indochina War, which was between the Viet Minh and France, to the Second Indochina War, which is the war between the communists and the non-communists. Americans call it the Vietnam War. So through talking about him, I think we could get a better understanding of how the Vietnam War happened, or the Second Indochina War. So
So,
should I? Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, I know that this is sort of your time period where you're a specialist in that time period. So he was born in 1913, and his father, I think, passed away in 1925 or 26. He was 13 when he became the king. Here's my early question: like, it's such a fascinating thing to me, but how much property and money did they have? Because you start to realize later that he lived a very lavish life in France in later years. And he had one of the biggest yachts in Monaco,
Oh, I
in
didn't
his
know that.
40s and 50s. It's insane. But I kind of want to know, around the time of his father, so this was a real king with real money. Um, where was their army? Where was their people?
Yeah. Yeah. Great. So I think this would be good to give a really quick bio. And then we can expand on some of these things that I mentioned and give more detail to them. So let's start with the father that you had just mentioned. His father was the 12th Nguyen emperor named Kaiden. So Bao Dai was born in 1913 and he died in 1997. He died in Paris when he was 84 years old, and he's today buried in a cemetery in Paris, Passy Cemetery. So that itself is pretty interesting. He's not buried in Vietnam. We wonder how many people actually visit his tomb. When he was born, he was not named Bao Dai. His name was Nguyen Phuc Vinh Thuy. That was his sort of citizen or civilian name. And as you mentioned, when he was 9, well, sorry, not yet. When he was 9 in 1922, he goes to France to study. And while in France, he becomes the 13th Nguyen emperor in 1926. He's 13 years old and he becomes the 13th Nguyen emperor. Bao Dai means keeper of greatness. And by the way, I think we should stop here and say, why are so many Vietnamese people named Nguyen? 40% of why is your last name Nguyen? Right?
That's a great intro to this win question.
Do you actually? I want to ask you first before I give my answer. Do you know why?
I've always heard growing up that it was the king who kind of gave people the choice to change their name during that time. I don't know if it was the first king, the first Nguyen king, and I'm not sure in what circumstances he make everybody change their name, or were people given a choice? Because obviously the entire country weren't forced to change their name.
Right. Yeah. So the Nguyen dynasty begins in 1802. I'll say a little bit of that more, but basically, it's because of the Nguyen dynasty. It's a way also to show loyalty to those in power. You don't want to get in trouble by the emperor, and you want to avoid persecution. You want to seem like you're part of the same family. And also, it's my understanding that last names in Vietnam are not all that important, it seems. That, well, you might as well change it. But it is tied to the Nguyen dynasty, the Nguyen emperors. So more on that later. But real quick, so he becomes 13th emperor in 1926, and then he returns to Vietnam, To Hue, in 1932 when he's 19 years old. And he is emperor of Annam and Tonkin. Remember in the last episode, we had talked about how Vietnam was divided into 3 parts: Tonkin in the north, Annam in the center, and Cochin China in the south. So Cochin China was directly ruled by France. So that's France's colony, while Tonkin and Annam was technically ruled by the Vietnamese monarchy, but under French protection. So it was Bao Dai who ruled the center and the north from 1926 to 1945. Then he abdicates. He leaves his throne in August 30, 1945. So that is marking this end of the Nguyen dynasty, but also the last emperor of Vietnam in general. So then from 1949 to 1954, Bao Dai agrees with the French to lead a new state,
which is called the Associated State of Vietnam. This is part of the French Union. It's still part of the French Empire. It's not totally independent. Keep in mind that at the same time, there's a competing group, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh. Then in October 1955, there's a vote, a referendum in the Associated State of Vietnam. Voters in South Vietnam can choose between Ngo Dinh Diem and Bao Dai. Bao Dai loses, Ngo Dinh Diem wins by 98%, which probably means fraud, right? Then the Associated State of Vietnam becomes the Republic of Vietnam, or as we know it, South Vietnam. Then from 1955 until he dies in 1997, Bao Dai stays in France. For 42 years, he's away from Vietnam, hanging out in France, living in luxury, as you had mentioned, hanging out on his yacht. He had numerous mistresses, I've read, Vietnamese and French women, and you had mentioned 13 kids. So that's the short bio.
You know, it's funny how humble you are when you say, I don't know anything about Bao Dai. Well, you didn't say I didn't know anything. You said, I don't know much. But you certainly do your research. And, you know, for me, there's always a million questions after one sentence that you give. You know, I'm so fascinated by, well, what happened to the army? Did they have an army before the French came in? Where did that if you have all this money, can't you pay for an army to kind of like defend yourself from this French invasion?
Yeah. Well, there was an army, but clearly it's not as powerful as the French, right? So a few things that we should talk about is the system of monarchy before the French come. So let's go back a little bit. The first emperor of the Nguyen dynasty is Yalong, who begins his rule in 1802. And basically, before 1802, there's kind of just chaos in what we call Vietnam today. There are competing kings and leaders and groups fighting each other. There's civil strife. And it's really Yalong, the first Nguyen emperor, who unifies Vietnam in 1802. And this is the start of the Nguyen dynasty. And the Nguyen dynasty is the last dynasty of emperors in Vietnam. Now, before there were many other dynasties, the Daesun, the Mac, the Lê, and competing warlords. There are also the Nguyen lords. But the emperor, the Nguyen dynasty is the last dynasty here. And so when Bao Dai ends, when he abdicates, he ends thousands of years of monarchical tradition in Vietnam. And this is interesting because if we contrast this with, say, Cambodia, the king in Cambodia, Norodom Sihanouk, he actually welcomes the French back to preserve his rule, to save the monarchy, and to fight those who are trying to create a constitutional democracy. And Laos, they will end their monarchy until 1975. But in Vietnam, we see the end of monarchy earlier. And as a monarch, when he was a monarch, he actually, from what I've read, he did try to do things. So he supported reforms in the judicial and educational systems. Not much is said about that, actually. From what I've read, he ends this ancient Mandarin custom for aides to touch their foreheads to the ground when they address the emperor. I guess he ended that. But really, he was much more known and famous for his leisure, right? He would go hunting in the forests, and he would hunt tigers and just hang out.
And this is the collapse of the monarchy. But you know, when I think about Thailand, they still have their king. And you think about all these other countries, you know, it makes you think about the infrastructure that you need to have as a monarchy to really contain the structure that you want. You know, it's not a joke. You can have all this money and all this in land and own all this stuff, but at some point, you know, you as a king can lose it all. And even if you have all the money, you can lose the control. And that's what I find very interesting about these monarchies. It's like, okay, well, who put you there? How did you keep that money or that governing power when you have all this money, but you still need to have sort of men to carry out your the wars and the defense spending, because you could have a lot of money and power. I mean, you could have a lot of money, but that does not mean you have power.
You know, Ken, this is great because so I'm teaching a class about revolution. And of course, we talk about the French Revolution. If there's one thing that you can learn about revolutions, and there are many things to learn, one thing is that when those in power start losing the loyalty of the elites, they're in trouble. It's when the elites start to feel alienated from those in power. That's when you start getting in trouble. I like to share this anecdote. So my wife, she worked in Washington, D.C. for the European Union delegation, and we would be invited to these kind of really fancy cocktail parties. And I would go there and I would see elites, man. They are in uniform. These are people in power. The food they were serving was amazing, like amazing sushi. And I couldn't help but think there's going to be no revolution anytime soon because these elites are happy, right? Think about the French Revolution, King Louis. And how did that revolution come about? It's when the elites start losing power and when the masses start to get really angry. And revolutions are actually quite rare throughout history. When people are oppressed, when people are poor, the first response is not going to be, let's get rid of the king. The first response is probably going to be, let's cope. Let's maybe pray for a better day. Let's hope. And maybe let's ask for demands. Revolution is actually not that common. So what is really interesting about Bao Dai is that he's around during the Vietnamese Revolution. So one thing I want to talk about now is his relationship to Ho Chi Minh and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which is led by communists. So let's dive into that. So some history again. Remember that the Japanese come and occupy Vietnam in
Around 1942, 1941?
1940.
1940. I was close.
You were, yeah. So the Japanese, what do? They allow Bao Dai to stay on his throne. But of course, the Japanese now have real power. And Bao
Wait,
Dai,
I got to stop you. How the heck did Japan come in and take over power from the French?
yeah. So as you know, what happens in 1939, the beginning of World War II? So what happens is that we have World War II start, and then soon in France, you have a collaborator government that cooperates with the Nazis, right, with the Germans, and that's called Vichy France. They control France from Vichy. Now Japan is allied with the Germans and with Vichy France. So, Japan at the same time is trying to spread its power in Asia. So they just take over Vietnam from France, but they still leave France to be in power. Remember, Vichy France collaborating with the Nazis, same with Japan.
I never knew this detail. I never realized that Japan, through Germany being controlled, or France being controlled by Germany, allowed them access into Vietnam. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes, sort of. I mean, remember, it's France that controls Vietnam, but then France becomes controlled by a pro-Nazi regime.
Got it.
Yeah. So Bao Dai cooperates with the Japanese, and then we're going to fast forward about 5 years here. Then in March of 1945, now this is when the months begin to become a little important, because in March of 1945, Japan is starting to realize it's going to lose World War II. What do? They basically leave, and they declare Vietnam independent under Bao Dai. So on their way out, they're kind of like, okay, Vietnam's independent under Bao Dai. But then in August
of
Wait, but why
1945.
would they do that? Why would they declare Bao Dai? Why would Japan give Bao Dai the keys back to the kingdom?
I mean, who else are they going to give it to? They cooperated with him, so they're like, all right, good luck, right?
Got it. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Then in August of 1945, Ho Chi Minh's group that he leads, which is called the Viet Minh, they make an uprising or a revolution, and they declare themselves to be Vietnam's new rulers. And they proclaim a new state, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. In short, we call them North Vietnam. And so the communists, and by the way, they are led by communists. The Viet Minh is actually a pretty big coalition, but the leaders are communists. And they don't want to share power with the emperor. And Ho Chi Minh famously declares the independence for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam on September 2nd, 1945. And what does Bao Dai do? He says, okay. He hands over the dynastic seal and the sword to Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Bao Dai, whose government collaborated with the Japanese, he agrees to abdicate, and he agrees to become an advisor to Ho Chi Minh. He wants to work with Ho Chi Minh and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Does that surprise you?
No, not at all. I don't think so. I think that when you grew up in France at 9 years old, right? And you're Western educated and you're like, all right, maybe it's time that there is no more monarch. And I think by that time in your life, you're just like, you know what? This is too much. I'd rather take all my money and I'll just go party and live it up in the West, right? I mean, in essence, why deal with such, this hot mess, when you can go and party and live and there's a yacht waiting for you in Monaco, right? Like, I mean, it's sad the more you kind of really think about it, because if we had a stronger character in Bao Dai, he would have stayed back and he would have fought against this sort of he would not have abdicated. He wouldn't leave his throne open. He would fight for the people. But I think leaving the country at such a young age and being educated in the West probably had something to do with him throwing in the towel. I don't know. That's my guess.
That's a really interesting perspective, because the perspective you just shared is not one where you would say, oh, he joined Ho Chi Minh because he was a patriot, right?
I think he was given a position of being a consultant, right? Like at that point, being a consultant, no, I'm the king. Why would you give me a consultancy position when I'm the actual king of Vietnam? Like you got to fight for that. But then maybe he didn't have elites on his side, or he didn't have a governing defense minister that would really fight back to say, you know what? I'm the monarch and I'm going to keep this going for as long as I can. He could have done something about it. I don't know.
That's interesting. Let me say this, though. So he abandons his title and he becomes a simple citizen Vinh Thuy. He goes back to his name that he was born with. He's no longer Bao Dai. But we have to keep in mind, though, Ken, that at this time, it is true. There is truth to say that Catholics, Buddhists, Cao Dai supporters, Hoa Hao followers, communists, and non-communists, they all wanted full independence for Vietnam. Many of them do. And so many of them were actually happy when Ho Chi Minh declares Vietnam's independence on September 2nd, 1945. The conflicts between communists and non-communists is certainly there, but it's not yet so violent that we will later see. So we have to keep in mind that when Ho Chi Minh declares independence, many people, including non-communists, are kind of excited about this. And so Bao Dai serves as an advisor to Ho Chi Minh, and this gives Ho Chi Minh and his new government some legitimacy in some people's eyes. And of course, some people thought that Bao Dai was just forced to do it. But I want us to consider one speech by Bao Dai just a few days before Ho Chi Minh's declaration of independence. So this is at the end of August. And I'm going to quote him. So Bao Dai says, I call on all parties and groups, all classes of society, as well as the royal family, to strengthen and support unreservedly the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in order to consolidate our national independence. As for us, we have known great bitterness during the 20 years of our rule. Henceforth, we are happy to assume the status of a free citizen in an independent country. We will allow no one to abuse our name or that of the royal family to sow discord among our compatriots. Long live the independence of Vietnam. Long live our democratic republic.
Okay,
What do you
can I
think
say?
of that?
Yeah, I'm chomping at the bit here. I'm just, this is just conjecture, but it just sounds like that is written by Ho Chi Minh with the gun to the emperor's head. It doesn't, just doesn't sound like it just sounds like a lazy man kind of abdicating and just getting the hell out and like, all right, here guys, here's the keys, I'm out. That's
interesting. That's interesting. That's an interpretation, right?
But I'm not as in the historical period as you. So contextually, from a very layperson's point of view, that's sort of the feeling I get based on just whatever I know, right? So I'm just speaking my mind out of a lack of a lot of details. I mean, it just sounds like somebody wrote the speech for him. He gave the speech, and now it's a way that he can slowly, get out of the position that he's in.
Okay, interesting. But would you also concede though that it's possible that he really meant what he said?
Yes, I think that history is very new. It could be very nuanced. I think history could be not black and white, and there is definitely a possibility that he agreed and probably made a few revisions to that based on somebody else writing it. And he goes, okay, this does sound like something that's safe and it can go out from my voice.
Okay. Yeah. So one other thing that I want to mention and quote from also is that he even personally writes to the president of France, begging the president to recognize Vietnamese independence. So I'll read that here. He says, quote, I would ask you, President of France, to understand that the only way to maintain French interests and France's spiritual influence in Indochina is to recognize frankly Vietnamese independence and to renounce any idea of reestablishing sovereignty or a French administration in any form whatsoever. We could so easily get along and become friends if you could stop claiming the right to become again our masters. What do you think of that?
Okay, that sounds very him.
Okay.
I could feel that because, yeah, that just sounds like. But then again, who knows who's behind these speech writers, right? But it does sound very, very honest and very respectful. But at the same time, like we are asking for our full rights back, and it sounds very honest to me.
Yeah. I also find it kind of amusing how he's like, look, Freds, if you want to maintain your interests and your spiritual influence over us, you better let us have sovereignty,
It's kind of ridiculous if you think about it, right? But at that time, was France totally weakened by World War II at that point?
Okay, excellent. Yes. The answer is yes. And we're going to get into that a little bit more. But real quick here, for the first time in what I just read to you, Bao Dai is openly challenging the French. That's significant for that first time. Now, keep in mind, the French have no Vietnamese partner anymore to rebuild their lost colonial state. So Ho Chi Minh declares independence. Bao Dai agrees. Now the French are kind of like, this is not good for us. It's the end of World War II. France is just devastated. France is ruined. France needs to rebuild. They need money. They need their colonies back. And what's amazing is that just 5 years later, from 1945, Bao Dai becomes the head of a new government opposed to Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So now what I want to get into is, how did that happen? So Bao Dai advises Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam for just about a year. Okay, this is from the summer of 1945 to probably around the summer of 1946. Then he just moves to Hong Kong to get away from it all. And keep in mind that 1946 is the start of the First Indochina War. This is a really awful war. This war, we understand it as a war between the Viet Minh and and France, basically. Viet Minh and France. It's an anti-colonial struggle where the Viet Minh is sort of this coalition getting lots of people under it, but it's led by communists. And keep in mind also that French governor generals who had been ruling Vietnam, for example, Albert Sarraut, they were trying to fashion Bao Dai as a child ever since he was a kid after World War I. They were trying to create him into sort of a weapon to fight anti-colonialists. They want to use him, right? They wanted him to be a symbol of French-Vietnamese collaboration, and they want to rule Vietnam through him. That's the intention of the French. So what happens? In 1947, the French ask Bao Dai, hey, can you please be the head of state for this new state called the Associated State of Vietnam? So the French say, we're going to agree to extend the monarchy to all of Vietnam, not just central Annam and Tonkin. So they're trying to negotiate with him because the French want him to work with all the other monarchs in Laos and Cambodia. And the French want to use all these monarchs to secure their presence in Indochina. And the French want somebody to oppose Ho Chi Minh's DRV, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, to serve their interests in France. So they see him as an alternative to Ho Chi Minh. And they need an alternative because the French colonial army is fighting Ho Chi Minh and Ho Chi Minh's guerrilla soldiers. So in 1947, they start talking with Bao Dai. Meanwhile, there's a war between France and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Now, this is the interesting part here. During this time, the non-communists are beginning to be even more opposed to Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Keep in mind that before they were collaborating with the DRV, I'm just going to say DRV for short, Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So they stop collaborating with the DRV and they have hopes of creating a non-communist republic, or maybe even a constitutional monarchy. And they're also turning to the Americans at this point, hoping that the Americans will help them because Americans had helped China's Chiang Kai-shek, who fought against Chinese communists, right? So the Vietnamese and non-communists are hoping the Americans will force the French to decolonize. So non-communists...
Let me interrupt you. So the U.S. at that time had a history of backing up anti-communist regimes, like you brought up Chiang Kai-shek of Taiwan. So the birth of Taiwan is happening under the sort of like the protection of the United States, which is a rising power. And whoever was in the South at the time began to say, hey, we can model whatever we're doing after Taiwan. Is that what sort of like why you brought that in?
Yeah, exactly. And the point of bringing that in is because after World War II ends in 1945, you had the beginning of the Cold War. And the Cold War is where we see this fight between communist countries versus so-called capitalist countries, and they're competing to get groups on their side. So the non-communists who oppose the DRV then agrees that they're going to have to stand behind Bao Dai. They thought that he was their best chance for forcing the French to accept Vietnam's independence. Now, Bao Dai it seems like he wasn't really sure what to do. So you have to imagine, put yourself in his shoes. The French are asking him, hey, can you come back to lead this new state against the DRV? He is still talking with the French, and some will write that he's refusing to be their puppet. He's like, look, I don't want to do this. But Bao Dai finally breaks from the DRV in 1947 in September. And he says, okay, I'm ready to talk again with the French.
Wait,
Now,
what makes him decide to break from the DRV?
That's a fantastic question here. There are different interpretations. Who knows? We can't get into his head here.
Yeah.
What's important here is that he becomes the representative of what we would call the third force. So this is a force describing the non-communist nationalists who support Bao Dai, right? So it's the struggle now is between the communists, the French, and the non-communists. So the non-communists enter into negotiations with France in 1947. This is important because this means that they're willing to risk continuing civil war with the DRV, using the French military to do so, instead of remaining within the DRV to force the French to decolonize.
Is this the birth of the South government? Now it sounds like this is where the birth of the South government begins, right?
There you go. That's why I think this is so significant.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the birth of the South Vietnamese government here. Exactly. So this group of non-communists, led by Bao Dai, they want to use France to get rid of their communist enemies. What do you think about this strategy, Ken? What do you make of this strategy? Do you think it's a smart one?
I don't know. It's very difficult to think about. Even in hindsight, with all the things that we know, I don't know, because you think about this French power that perhaps had the munitions and the technology to fight back. And so you think, all right, well, we want a capitalist society. We want to go and have a little bit more freedom. And you fight back, and that's the only way that right? Is using, but it could go either way if you think about it. I'm sure in the history of mankind, many groups probably have done that with success, and then probably many have not with failure. I think it could have gone both ways.
And to complicate it even more, Ken, we don't even know if they were trying to create capitalism, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
We have to keep in mind that there were many different anti-communist groups with their own visions. Even Ngo Dinh Diem, he would describe his ideology, personalism. We're going to talk much more about this in the episode on Ngo Dinh Diem. But he claimed to be anti-capitalist and anti-communist. He was explicit. He said, my ideology is a middle way between anti-capitalism and communism. So that's his personalism. We'll say more about that. But yeah, so it's a risky strategy. The non-communists, they don't have an army. They're going into negotiations with France, and they kind of assume that the communists would lose and France would sort of just agree to give Vietnamese independence within the French Union. So then what happens? In March of 1949, Bao Dai signs an accord that creates the Associated State of Vietnam. So that's formally established in June 1949, and he rules over it. This is a new non-communist state, and it faces an uphill battle. It's like a baby state, right? Keep in mind the French have broad authority over this state. The French government accepts the unification of Cochin China with Annam and Tonkin, and in exchange, Bao Dai has to lead the state. Bao Dai knows that the French I think he knows that the French are using the Associated State of Vietnam as a weapon to hold onto colonial control. I think I could be wrong here, but so what does he do? He kind of just stays in Dalat. He rarely dresses up in royal garb. He kind of refuses to play his part. And this is interesting because if we are more sympathetic to Bao Dai, we might be like, okay, maybe he'll just try to be as useless as possible as a sort of resistance, that might be a form of resistance. What can he do? So, we might say that he's trying to undermine the legitimacy of the state. Who knows? But what he does undermine the legitimacy of the state. And some will say he refuses to be France's puppet. But some others will say he just wants to live a lavish life, and he just lets his advisors, who are also backed by the French, make all the big decisions. He hangs out with his mistresses. He goes hunting and so on.
When I think about him retreating in Dalat, if the listeners are thinking about Dalat's a cooler climate. It's in the sort of mountainous, higher elevation, known for, a place of R&R. You go there to relax from the heat of Saigon and not deal with what's going on in the city. And I think that when I think about Bao Dai retreating to Dalat, that's problematic to me.
Why is it problematic? How so?
Because if you are going to really participate in the politics of the country, you have to be in Washington, D.C. You have to be in the political capital of the country, which at the time in the South was in Saigon. And you retreating off to the Hamptons, basically, you're retreating off to a vacation spot to rule from there. Right. Symbolically, it just does not make any sense whatsoever. I mean, to somebody standing outside that, this is me sitting outside of history or understanding history, but just understanding sort of like the just the lay of the land and how things are, situated in those cities. You're really not anywhere near the political discourse that you need to be in.
Right. And let's zoom out a little bit here. This is the early 1950s. Bao Dai is hanging out in Dalat, leading the associated state of Vietnam, which is backed by the French. Meanwhile, Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam, they are doing a land reform in the north, and they are preparing for war against the French. They're engaged in battle here. Now, at the same time, the early 1950s, France is trying to recast to the world and to the United States that this is a fight against the DRV and for the associated state of Vietnam, that this is part of a Cold War struggle against communism. And by this time, we know that the Americans want to contain communism. So they begin to back the French. And the French are saying, yes, the French in Indochina is crucial to contain communism. Now, in 1954, the French are kicked out they're defeated at Dien Bien Phu in May of 1954. There's a peace agreement, of course, in Geneva, and what it does is that it divides Vietnam into two. I mean, many listeners know this, into North and South, right? Bao Dai tries to become the leader of South Vietnam, but it was Ngo Dinh Diem who organized this vote that I had mentioned in 1955, and Ngo Dinh Diem wins by 98%, right? And this removes Bao Dai from the picture. So really, finally, this is really the end of Bao Dai and the monarchy in Vietnam. But as war escalates between the communists and the anti-communists, and as the US becomes involved, Bao Dai basically is silent about everything that's going on. So he kind of just drops out of the picture at this point, 1955. Ngo Dinh Diem wins, and he kind of just drops out. But he did say something in 1972. I found this quote. So he's in France, and he says, quote, "The time has come to put an end to the fratricidal war and to recover at last peace and accord." So that's what he says.
That sounds very honest to me. Yeah. It sounds very honest, very just like a man who's been defeated, just ready to throw in the towel. I'm here. I'm ready to party. I'm out of this.
Yeah, I mean, he immediately goes to France, and I had mentioned he's just there for the rest of his life. By the way, so I mean, this comes to this very kind of sad conclusion of Bao Dai here. I found this kind of amusing. I didn't know that recently. Did you know this? His Rolex watch was sold for $5 million,
And yep.
and it was the most expensive Rolex ever sold. And it was his because he asked when he was in Geneva for one of these diplomatic trips in 1954. He asked him, "Hey, give me the rarest Rolex that you can give me."
See, and that makes me think about, okay, those kinds of details, the yacht, I think it was like the second most expensive yacht in the Monaco harbor at the time. Where did you get the money and how did you siphon off all this money? And where did it go? How did it get transferred to France? And I think that Nam Phuong, his first wife, lived in castles in France. They had a lot of money that
Yeah.
that the family, you can't just like be a king and not have all this wealth sort of show up in Paris, in France.
Right. I mean, his son still today lives in a nice place. And I was watching some documentaries. Yeah, there was a castle involved for sure.
Yeah, and I try to empathize with what I would do if I was in his situation. It's very difficult. But I think had he not gone to the West to study at 9 years old, I think he would have been a different person. I think that really kind of was a big, a historical mistake to send your son off to the West to study at that early age and become completely westernized and go, you know what? I look back on my people and go, there's no way technologically that we're going to be able to defend it ourselves. Now that you're living in the West as a 9-year-old and you're educated all of these years as a French person, there's no way that you're going to go back and go, wait, there's a chance that I can really rescue the country.
But hold on a second, Ken. It was not at all a mistake. The French intentionally are trying to do exactly this. They're trying to cultivate someone who they can rule Vietnam through. So it
This
makes
was a
perfect
plan.
sense.
This was a
The
plan.
The governor generals have this plan.
So his father was talked into having Bao Dai sent to France at 9.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
that makes sense.
these were the policies of the governor generals, Albert Sarraut being one of them. They want to create a loyal class of indigenous. How better to create a loyal class by giving them nice stuff?
Oh, that is diabolical. That is just truly evil colonial thinking. Yeah, you groom him at 9. I'm like, whoa, why would the king allow your son to be kind of indoctrinated by the West so early on? I can understand leaving the college at 19 or 20 and then sort of having this fully formed identity as a Vietnamese citizen, and then having that loyalty to your people. But at 9, you're just completely gone at that point. You're taken over.
Yeah, perhaps. But at the same time, part of me still wants to be like, well, maybe he did have thoughts of his own and maybe he did have desires for Vietnam of his own, but he was put into certain constraints. I don't know, but that's my more sympathetic side. But at the same time, I'm like,
Did his father, the king, have more sons, or was he the only one?
Kaiden, I'm not sure. I didn't do research on Kaiden here. That's a good
Yeah.
question.
But it's truly sad, no matter how you slice it. I mean, the bigger, more scarier power brought the little boy in at 9 and really indoctrinated him. So you have full control over his thinking at that point. When you're thinking about the sort of the reference point of having such a young mind, leave to Paris to live.
Yeah. So what's significant here then is that, okay, Ngo Dinh Diem wins the vote and he becomes the new leader of a new state called the Republic of Vietnam. And the associated state of Vietnam no longer exists. Now the French are really out of the picture. Ngo Dinh Diem kind of ends, actually. The North, Ho Chi Minh's DRV, kick out the French in the North. Ngo Dinh Diem really finishes this process of kicking out the French. Ngo Dinh Diem was an anti-colonialist. Now this is really the beginning of this awful, awful civil war between.
Wait a minute, but who funded Ngo Dinh Diem at that point? It had to be another superpower. Like did the U.S. fund Ngo Dinh Diem at that point? Where's you getting the money?
The U.S. is beginning to send in advisors and help, and I'm sure money by 1955.
Yeah. So it's like replacing one colonial power for an imperial power.
That's one perspective, right? That's one perspective. But another perspective would be, we have all kicked out the colonizer. Now we're having our own civil war about what Vietnam should look like.
Yeah.
And one side gets the help from the Americans, the other side gets the help from the Soviet Union and China.
Right. And that is sort of where we probably end with Bao Dai and talk about sort of, I know that he came to the United States in 1988, I believe, or something like that. He died in 1992. It was just a few years before he came, and he seemed like he, in the videos, it seems like he has all his faculties. He's very lucid, and doesn't speak much though. You don't see him saying a whole lot of because maybe he was not a leader type. Maybe he just was not that person who was deeply involved and engaged in politics.
Yeah. Bao Dai is so significant in my mind because it's so symbolic, because the idea of a monarchy is that the whole nation, the whole country is embodied in the figure of one king, a body, But when that ends, what do you replace it with? This is really where we see struggles between communists. We have Stalinists and Trotskyists and other versions of communism. There are communists who disagree with each other and fighting with each other, but they really believe in communism. And among the non-communists, we have so many groups fighting each other as well. So it's interesting to me that once you have this glue of the nation die, then there's just all this fighting over what Vietnam should look like.
Yeah. It is a confusing time. And when you think about how Britain sort of their monarchy survives, and it's just a symbolic sort of position, and there's a parliament and governing body. It's fascinating how that even exists.
You say it's symbolic, but it's much more than that. I remember being in London at a pub when I'm like 22, and I'm talking to these working class like Londoners, and I asked them what they think about the monarch. And I swear, I'll never forget this. They look me in the eye and they say, "I am proud to be a subject of the Queen." And that was amazing. That was really remarkable, because it really showed me that it means a lot to people. And it's very powerful for a lot of people. To be sure, a lot of people hate the monarchy. They want to get rid of it. But it is a source of national identity, national pride, and a source of meaning even. It's just fascinating how people will see that as a glue. I live in the Netherlands where there is a king, and I saw the king, and people love the royal family here.
Yeah. I think that back in the day, the whole idea of celebrity culture is the monarchy. And I think the monarchy, before all of the sort of press coverage and modernity of human life, before all of that was sort of like the press, and monarchs had to, they were able to do whatever they want. I think in the modern age where there is coverage of them, so I think things started to transition into you being, as a monarch, somebody who's popular, somebody who's well liked by the people, well liked by the elites. And I think the King of Thailand is sort of one of these perfect examples of, let's let the government do their thing, but I'm going to be the king and I'm going to do my thing. And I think that was like up until his death, he was very, very popular. And I think Queen Elizabeth was very popular in Britain, to be the subject of the Queen. And so I think that the monarchs, the modern monarchs, don't rule with an iron fist, and they just don't put people and subjects to death as easily as they did before all of the modern press coverage of the the modern times.
One thing that's interesting specifically, though, about Asian monarchies, and specifically East Asian or Confucian, Chinese, Vietnamese, is because it's really influenced by Confucianism. And the ideal government for Confucius and Confucians was one where the monarch would serve the people and make the people happy, and so that people wouldn't complain or debate about politics. If people started debating about ideas and politics, that's when you knew the government was in trouble because you weren't doing your job. And one thing that I wanted to mention is that I often go to Hue. Do you go to Hue?
I've been there one time, in maybe in 99 or 2000.
Yeah. It's so symbolic if you go there, because what you see is just ruins. You see a dead monarchy. Like, this was the seat of power for Vietnamese emperors. And now it's just kind of overgrown with grass and just empty. And it's really symbolic to me because it really shows that the Vietnamese Revolution really was a revolution. Not all anti-colonial struggles are revolutions. Often anti-colonial struggles just want to get rid of the colonizer and maybe replace it with what they had before. But the Vietnamese Revolution was to get rid of the colonizer and replace it with the opposite of a monarchy. What is that? Well, we call it a republic where power is with the people. But then you have the Democratic Republic of Vietnam for Ho Chi Minh. Then we have the Republic of Vietnam for the anti-communists. So what does that mean? What does democracy really mean? What does republic really mean? That's my point. That's all I want to say, that it was a revolution.
Great question. I think we're done with Bao Dai, and I hope that we have more things to sort of, using this time period and Bao Dai as a sort of a reference point for future conversations about other figures in Vietnam. And this was thank you for doing a lot of the heavy lifting as usual, and I thoroughly enjoyed researching about Bao Dai with you.
Thanks, Ken. I learned a lot about this too, just researching this.
So
thank you.
we are going to tease out who our next person was, and you and I spoke about that. So would you like to share it, Kevin?
Yeah, so he's another figure that I write about in my book, The Architects of Dignity, and it is Phan Chu Trinh. So our first episode, we discussed Phan Boi Cho, and now we're going to discuss a friend of Phan Boi Cho, and that's Phan Chu Trinh, Vietnam's first Democrat.
Kevin, thank you so much for today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. Special thanks to Brittany Tran, to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast.